So this session is titled Movement and Routes. In this session, we'll be examining the complex dynamics of global trade routes and the transoceanic flow of goods, highlighting the significance of glass beads within these exchanges. The speakers will consider the course of commodities such as gold, metals, woods, palm oil, and other goods that entangled Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Emphasizing the crucial role of maps in developing economic structures, they will explore how charting physical territories also shaped economic policies and power dynamics. The session delves into how these cartographic tools influence the expansion of trade networks and the establishment of colonial enterprises, and considers the impact on indigenous economies and societies. By examining these themes, the session proposes a nuanced understanding of the historical significance of movement and routes in shaping the economic landscape across continents and cultures. I'm delighted to introduce you to our three panelists for this afternoon session. First of all, we have Anne Ruderman, who is an assistant professor of economic history at the London School of Economics. Her first book, Supplying the Slave Trade, will be published by Yale University in 2025, so look out for that. Then we will hear from Nadia Kisukidi, who is a writer and philosopher and a member of the editorial committee of Les Cahiers d'études africaines. She is working as associate professor in philosophy at Paris 8 Vincennes Saint-Denis University. Finally, we will be hearing from Vinicius de Aguiar Furuyui, a Brazilian anthropologist who has published works on Amazonia and Japan. Currently, he works as assistant professor in the anthropology department at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. So without further ado, I will let Anne introduce her research.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. So I'm going to talk about Conterie in terms of, you can switch the slide, in terms of pathways, in terms of both space and time. I want to think about pathways and routes both temporally as well as spatially. So I'm a historian, and I encountered Conterie while I was researching my dissertation, now my book. And broadly, I was looking at how Europeans figured out what goods to bring to Atlantic Africa to purchase captives. How did they know what to put on their ships, what to send to their forts? How did they understand their consumer marketplace and then meet that consumer demand? How do they get the supplies? And so as I was researching here, I researched Venetian beads as one of the goods in the Archivio di Stato. This sort of archive book or a box is my portal into the past. And when you're sitting in the archives, the person next to you might be researching the Ottoman Empire or Venetian government institutions. And so it's this like little kind of personal tunnel into the past. And it was really interesting for me to go to the pavilion yesterday and see all the Conterie as objects, because I encountered Conterie as a word. And what I was reading here were reports that the Venetian ambassador in London, Cesare Vignola, was sending back to the Venetian Senate in the 1760s as he was trying to win the Liverpool, there's this beads business in Liverpool, and as he was trying to win their business for the Venetians, to secure Venice as a sole supplier. And so I was reading his ambassadorial reports, and Italian is my second language, so he was very verbose guy. I don't read every single word, and instead I scan for Conterie, and then I say, okay, I have to start reading here. And he actually spelled it with an A in Venetian. And so this, you can see, is the word that I was looking for. And one of the really kind of great parts about doing research in Venice and researching a Venetian subject, as opposed to when you go to the National Archives in Kew or the Archives d'Outre-mer in Aix-en-Provence, is the archive is embedded in the setting in which the materials are about. And this was particularly relevant in terms of Conterie because all day long I was sitting there training my brain on this word, and then I would come out and I would see advertisements for Conterie in Murano, like tourist things, and I think, oh, I just found it. And then I would remember, no, I'm on my way home. So as I was walking through the cityscape, I would sort of see this reflection of my research still in the present. The second pathway I want to talk about is a pathway in space within Europe, from the European interior, Venice, to the Atlantic Rim, Liverpool. So I was reading these ambassadorial reports. You can flip the slide. And Cesare Vignola was sort of aghast or bereft that this Liverpool beads business was sourcing part of their materials from Bohemia, from Franconia, from Prague. And he sort of saw his job as a way to restore the manufacturing that was rightfully Venice. Venice had been manufacturing beads. The first guild statutes were in the 13th century, and bead making was very much part of civic identity. And you can see here, these are some of the advertisements from the 18th century from bead makers. And that lion, that's like the symbol of Venice, right? As you walk around, you see the lion everywhere. And you can see that they're using themes of abundance, the cornucopia, the fountain, and then, of course, there, down on the right, maritime trade. And so these are all the ways that the Venetians are conceptualizing the beads business as part of their civic identity. And so this Vignola was writing to the Senate, and he explains like the Atlantic economy. He explains how the slave trade works. And to him, Liverpool is like at the edge of the world. He details his travel itinerary. I mean, he's basically asking for his expenses to be paid. But he presents it as he's going to this like really far off place. And he sends the Senate a map of Liverpool. This is actually a pretty well-known map by John Ives. So this was pretty recent. It was about 3 years old. So they can know where in the world is he talking about. So there's this kind of movement between the interior of Europe to the coast, but also a sense of movement in the shifting gravity of what had been the manufacturing center of Europe as Venice kind of lost out, as the Mediterranean lost out to the Atlantic. So we have this sort of shifting of gravity. The third pathway that I want to talk about is the pathway within Africa, from the African interior to the Atlantic African coast, and then from Liverpool down to the Atlantic African coast. I think about, in terms of trade, I think about the Atlantic African coast as a meeting point of two vertical systems. One is going from the interior to the coast and back again, and one is coming from Europe down to the interior coast. There's various sort of slave ships move along the coast, but trade goods and captives actually don't move along the coast as much. They move sort of in through the interior and down. And so in this negotiation that happened between Cesare Vignola and this beads business, the beads business are trying to get to see if the Venetians can make the beads that they want. And these people write letters upon letters upon letters, and like their email inboxes would be very full. But there was one sentence that really stood out to me. Thomas Hodgson in Liverpool is writing to Vignola, and he said, "There's this one bead we want. There's a kind of changeable color and dimness shown into it, which makes it much esteemed on one part of the coast of Africa." And what he's talking about, that changeable color, is what we call dichroic. It's a bead that is one color in transmitted light and another color in reflected light. And the beads that he is trying to get the Venetians to make actually have a centuries-long history. He doesn't know this, of course. But these were beads, they're called Segi beads, or I believe this is what he's talking about. They were originally manufactured at Ile Ife, and which is in the center there, starting in the late 11th century. They were thought to have divine powers. The discussion of Native American beads this morning was really interesting because they were supposedly to have come from Olokun, who was the goddess of bead making and of water and of fertility. And there were, of course, many different color beads. And as sort of Yoruba power grew, and as Yoruba ideology of sacred kingship spread, the use of these beads spread as well. And other places that took on this ideology of sacred kinship also adopted beads. Beads were currency, they were ornamentation, but they were also symbols of political power. They were regalia, and they also had sort of medicinal properties. And so by the time, in the 18th century, there was no more bead manufacturing at Ile Ife. There was a little bit of manufacturing at Ascobo, which is about north. And so there was sort of not quite enough supply. And one thing that archaeologists have discovered over the past kind of 15 years is that the glass beads that were manufactured in Ile Ife were of a very different formula than glass beads that had been manufactured in Europe and elsewhere around the world. They were called what HLHA, a high lime, high alumina formula. And this was a local formula that depended on local ingredients. The lime came from snail shells, and the alumina came from sand. So this was a really kind of natural creative product. And it spread, in Europeans report finding sage beads sort of all the way west as far as Elmina in modern-day Ghana. And the final pathway that I want to talk about is, again, a pathway in time from the 18th century through the 19th century and then today. So a later ambassador named Gasparo Soderini, he was in London at the time when the question of abolition came up in Parliament. And he was very much sort of taken with this debate. British Parliament spent about 20 years debating abolition of the slave trade before it happened. And so this is at the very beginning. And he says it's a little bit cut off, but he writes about this spirit of compassion is sort of surging with enthusiasm in this country that happens sometimes. And, after centuries of large profits and cruel commerce of men, it's correcting himself. And he talks about the sort of horrible way that captives have been taken with pessimiarti from their homeland and enriched the soil of the New World through their lives and through their bloods. And he's sort of taken this kind of abolitionist spirit to heart, but he also writes later, I don't follow these discussions except for to see the way in which will impact the beads trade. So he actually makes the connection, and he comes to the conclusion, it's an interesting conclusion, he thinks abolition will be helpful for the bead trade because then more of the original consumers will stay in Africa as opposed to be dispersed throughout the world. So he's sort of saying this, and it was interesting to listen to the conversation about East Africa in the 19th century. So he sort of sees abolition as something that would be good for business, in fact, for Venice. In the 19th century, in 1884, some people put together little packages, little pamphlets of these Senate reports that I read as wedding gifts. A nozze is a wedding. And so these are couples, Milan and Trese and Vicenti and Comello, and I think their families had been attached to the bees business. I think these were glass-making families, but they basically reprinted some of Cesare Vignola's dispatches and some reports from the Cinque Savi alla Mercanzia, the Board of Trade, and from the Senate about this negotiation, about this effort to win the beads business and also to not pay some sort of customs duties by shipping them on Venetian boats for Venice. And this is a really interesting moment because Italy acquired its first sort of colonial foothold in 1882. There was a port on the Red Sea. And then Italy colonial ambitions were very high at this moment until essentially the defeat of the Italian army in 1896 in Ethiopia. But this is a moment when, Italians sort of thought that they were going to join the great powers on the world colonial stage. So it's not an accident that he reached back at this time and got these Senate reports as if to say, look, Italy has been this great colonial player this whole time. And so this is how it was kind of memorialized in the late 19th century. And then today, of course, looking at Kapwani's exhibit, we get this reconsideration both of, the value of beads. Sort of the 19th century is when this kind of giga myth really take hold, this reconsideration of the multiplicity of the value of beads, but also I would suggest of the complicity of places that are far away from the Atlantic Rim in the slave trade and in colonialism. We don't think about Venice and Atlantic world slavery. And this is a map of goods that were produced throughout Europe for the slave trade. And really, as you can see, that deep into the European interior, they were producing goods that were taken from Atlantic ports and brought down to the Atlantic African coast to purchase captives. And so looking, from the 18th to the 19th to the 21st century and then back in time, I think there's a real dialogue between the present and the past.